Jeremy is the executive director of LINC, which is an acronym for Living Independence Network Corporation. And he's also the co-founder of Idaho Access Project. He has a really great knowledge of all of this. So Jeremy, would you like to go ahead and take it away?
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for the invite and showing up to the Silver Linings talk. This is a fantastic, like, kind of ongoing venue to share really cool things that are happening in a time that is not always really cool. So when Cynthia asked me if I'd be interested in Silver Linings, it struck a chord because we have been talking in the disability community about some silver linings that have come up strangely enough during COVID. And I'm going to get to that a little further down the road. But what I wanted to do, I want to first recognize, let me just first say it's great also to see so many familiar faces, Elaine and Jim and Diane and Deanna, and there are other folks on here I'm sure I know, Mark. I also want to recognize Mark Leeper, who is up in Moscow, and he is the director of the Disability Action Center Northwest out of Moscow. And it's a center for independent living, just like LINC, but it serves the northern region. And then we have a sister organization in eastern Idaho called LIFE, and they serve, I think, about 18 counties in eastern Idaho. I also want to recognize Christina, who is on here, who works for LINC down in Twin Falls. I don't know how you got this email, but someone's going to hear about it. And Christina works on the transportation program in Twin Falls, which is a really awesome program. And even more importantly, works to help transition people out of institutions back into their homes. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important as well. So Mark and Christina, thank you for joining me and making this even more difficult. All right, so I was told this was informal. So what I want to talk about are a couple things. I want to give you kind of a really high level snapshot of the history of disability and the disability rights movement and how we got to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then how that act has kind of played out over the last 30 years. We are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the ADA this year, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But then also, Cynthia mentioned some shortfalls, and I might characterize it a little bit in a different way. Shortfalls is not inaccurate, but I think just recognizing that a law can only go so far, and that people have to have agency, and they have to have a vision for their own lives, and they have to be actively engaged in the independent living movement, which is a movement that I work in and Mark and Christina work in. And then talk a little bit about the silver linings that have come out of COVID, which there are a lot of negative things that have happened as a result of COVID, and I'll talk about a few of those as well. But there are some really interesting silver linings, particularly around communication and technology, which we have been experiencing as a movement in Idaho over the last several months as technology has changed and how we all interact changes. And that interaction, although has been just kind of a work transition for everybody from home to office using Zoom, that's actually been pretty revolutionary for a lot of people with different disabilities to be able to more fully participate in all of the things that are going on just in life, but in advocacy in particular. So, okay, high level view, and feel free to ask questions. I'm told that I will be interrupted, and you will have a chance to insert questions wherever you want, so please do that. I guess I'll start out just by talking about the history of disability. Gary, it's good to see your face. Disability has been around forever. I mean, as long as people have been around, disability has been around. And the way I kind of break it up, and the way social scientists kind of break it up historically, is you have these different periods of time. Like you had the period of time from really early 1050 up to 1600, for example, on the planet Earth. And during that period of time, all the way up until today, people with disabilities have experienced wildly different society in wildly different ways. Way back in the day, religion and the religious model played a really big role in how we interpret and understand and deal with disability. So people who had a disability, maybe it was a developmental or an intellectual disability, or a physical disability, or a disability with vision or hearing, those folks, they could be interpreted in a couple different ways. I mean, they could be playing out purgatory on earth before they went to hell. They could be closer to God with a disability. They could be being punished as a result of something they did because they had a disability. And all of that was really through this lens of religious institutions. And care for people was also done through religious institutions like medical institutions and things, but they were very religiously based. But then we get to that period of time, which we're all familiar with, where we saw that religious model change to a scientific model. And we started to explain differences in society in different ways, not as a result of religion, for example, but in terms of a really rudimentary understanding of like science and physics and chemistry and things like this. Getting closer to the Industrial Revolution, and during that kind of time period, you saw, especially in Europe, you saw the proliferation of lots of different asylums. This was a period of time when people were moved from communities and homes where they had supports, if they weren't in an institution, a religious institution, and then they were institutionalized. And so people were moved into places that were isolated. There are a lot of, in fact, I'll share with you, let's see, some photos that I thought would just, and I don't have a lot of these, but this is an example of the Royal Albert Asylum. I believe this is in England, and it's an example of what you might see if you were taking a train between cities. Off in the distance on the hillside, you would see a large building, a facility, the big smokestacks and the water, sources of water, the big water drums they have up in the air, I forget, water tanks. And you would see that off in the distance, and that's where people would often be institutionalized if they had a disability. And back then, there was a lot of blurring between what it means to have an intellectual disability or a developmental disability or a mental health issue. There wasn't, clearly, because we didn't have a lot of science back then, but there was a lot of like commingling of treatment for people, if you will. So that happened until this institutionalization happened until about World War II. And up until this time, or World War I, and up until this time, people were, some of these institutions that people were put into were really kind of awful, because the idea was that people weren't supposed to be too comfortable, right? You were there to be treated because you had a disability or something. And if you could work, or if you didn't want to tolerate that environment, then they wanted to create an environment where people were kind of, pushed out. And this was the whole idea that even the idea of in-home care back during this period of time was plagued with the idea that people would become lazy if they had in-home care. Just a lot of weird stereotypes, not a lot of good scientific knowledge, understanding. And it resulted in people, like I said, ending up in institutions, and kind of viewed as not worth anything, or not adding value to the community. All of that kind of radically changed with World War I, because you had the advancement of medical technology, as you do with all conflicts. You had a lot of people who had gone off to war who were not lazy bums who didn't want to get a job and just wanted to sit in their house and getting home and community-based services, apparently. And you had people who were coming back from war who were alive because of the medical advancements, but also had serious disabilities, either shell shock, or they had limbs missing, or all kinds of problems. And so it was at that point that people kind of shifted their mentality and said, hey, wait a second, like these folks who went off to war made the ultimate sacrifice and came back and are not complete. And do we interpret them as being not valuable? And so that really, I think, started to change some of the mentality about disability. World War II, same thing, advancements in technology, and a lot of folks coming back from the battlefield who survived, but then were living their lives with a disability. And then we really saw this play out during the Vietnam War. And I'll throw some other photos up here. Okay, so this is a photo from, I believe, Europe, and it's folks. This gentleman, I think, lost both his legs in the war, and it just to me really was emblematic of like this idea that, you know, people who have disabilities can also be heroes, right? Like they can also go off and fight and defend for the country, and even though they come back with a disability, that doesn't mean that they're any less valuable as human beings. This should be a more recognizable image. This is the cat from Born on the 4th of July, if you've seen that movie. Tom Cruise was in that film, and he portrayed a veteran from the Vietnam War who came back paralyzed, and kind of his journey through the medical institutions of the military, and then having to deal with being back in a community where you can't really access much of anything. You can't leave your house. You can't get into restaurants or go to school or really do anything. And so all of those conflicts resulted in a shift in how we view folks with different types of, particularly physical disabilities. And that set the stage in part for what we know is kind of the modern disability rights movement. Now, I say that, but it should be recognized that the disability rights movement has been played out in people's homes and communities as families and individuals for years, for decades, for 100 years. It's not something new, but it is something that caught the wind in the sails of the civil rights movement of the 60s. In addition to kind of the impact of folks coming back from war and the advancements of technology and all these sorts of things. One thing I will mention, and if you haven't seen it, you should watch a film called Crip Camp. This is the story of a camp that was in the Catskills in New York, I think, and it was originally founded in the 50s, and then in the 60s and 70s, it kind of really focused exclusively on serving young people with disabilities. And it was this, you just need to watch the movie because I won't do it justice, but it tells the story of this community of people who ended up being the people who in large part helped move the Americans with the Disabilities Act forward, okay? But to hear the impact that this camp had, where people were surrounded by other folks that look like them, that have the same things they're dealing with as everybody else. I mean, it's really a revolutionary experience to have. I was in, the first time I experienced that was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I think it was last year. There was a conference for a rural disability organization, a national organization. And, you know, I've been around folks with disabilities for a long time and having one myself, which I'll talk about. But it was just remarkable to see what happens when there's 300 young people who are blind and deaf and have cerebral palsy and have developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities and are using wheelchairs and manual wheelchairs and power wheelchairs and walkers and canes. And I mean, it's just, everybody just kind of picks up the slack for everybody else, and everybody collectively makes the group whole in a sense, and in a weird sense, and people support one another. The guys in the chairs or gals in the chairs would, you know, help make sure somebody who can't see is getting where they need to go. And so, you know, but to see all these folks in a room with all the pressure that society puts on you to be a person with a disability just kind of like fall off, and you get to experience a space that is uniquely a disabled space is really a really incredible thing. And I that was my only experience. So that's the only lived experience I could draw on to try and understand what this camp was like. And it must have been incredible, an incredible experience. and this was in the 60s and the 70s. And we saw the beginnings of what would ultimately end up culminating in the ADA, in a number of laws that started in 68 and then went through the 70s and 80s and then ultimately 1990 with the ADA. And how this all played out was there was a lot of work to remove barriers for people, especially physical barriers in federal buildings, because Congress could enact that. If people used any money whatsoever from the federal government, then they had to comply with what was called the 1968 Architectural and Barriers Act. And that was really kind of one of the first powerful laws that opened the door to people to get access to buildings and things. As you can imagine, like veterans coming back and not being able to get training or get into federal buildings and things like that, that was a real problem. Then we saw in 1973, the year I was born, the Section 504, and that is a law that I think also said that if you had any federal money being spent, and Mark can correct me if I'm wrong, but again, this gets to if you have any federal money being spent, there are requirements for access that have to be met. That law was passed in 73, and after the law was passed, rules needed to be promulgated. And so it took several years for the actual nuts and bolts of this law to be put into place. And in fact, there were a couple of times where it looked like those rules would be either watered down or the intent of 504 would have been nullified. And so there was a lot of pressure being put on the government. And in fact, and the Malheur boys at the federal occupation are not going to be happy about this. The disability rights movement still has the longest running federal building occupation in our country's history, I believe. And it happened in the late 70s in all over the country. There were places, federal buildings that were being occupied, but in San Francisco in particular, there was an occupation that lasted 28 days. The Malheur occupation, I think, was 24 days. And imagine that, right? Like these buildings are already not accessible. So imagine you're a quadriplegic that uses a power chair, or you're somebody that can't turn themselves at night to prevent getting pressure sores, or just getting access to all the medical equipment that you need and the medical supplies, and showering yourself and bathing yourself and keeping yourself clean so that you don't get infections and just stuff that happens if you're not taking care of yourself properly. These folks occupied this building for 28 days. And what was really cool about this is all the support they had. I was just on a Black Lives Matter call about just how nonprofits can respond to some of those issues. And it made me think about this, because in this occupation, the Black Panthers actually showed up to feed people during this occupation. And they were asked, like, why are you doing that? And the folks with the Black Panthers were like, you guys are all trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to make the world a better place. Why wouldn't we come down here and support you? So that was really kind of and then you saw in the 80s, you saw, if you remember Geraldo Rivera, yeah, his expose on institutions and how horrible that was, kind of revealing what was happening behind closed doors in different facilities. But you also had the Reagan administration, which was trying to deregulate everything, right? That's what happens. And so once again, some of these laws were coming under attack because the administration wanted to get rid of the rules and get rid of the regulations, which were the teeth of the laws. And part of the problem at this time too was that all disabilities were treated differently. So disability was not seen as a civil rights issue, and people with disabilities were considered their own separate class. And this work, this effort, this super grassroots organizing, and it just makes me shudder to think about back in the 80s trying to community organize across the country, like just with letters and phone calls. And like, I mean, we do everything on email in a millisecond, and all of this had to be done without any of the modern day communication technology that we have. 1988, we're getting close to the end of this. We saw the we saw the first version of the ADA introduced. And then in 1990, I believe that was when Congress had kind of committed to take this up. There were some, and also strangely enough, George W. Bush, who signed the ADA into law, was the vice president of Ronald Reagan during Reagan's kind of attack on regulation. And it's interesting, the lessons and the power of these personal stories that people told, because the Bush administration kind of eventually got it. And, you know, when he became president, he kind of, you know, in my eyes, did kind of a 180 a little bit from the previous administration, signing this thing into law. There was a period of time where right before this thing got signed into law, that it was unclear if they would actually get the job done. And that's when a whole nother mobilization happened, bringing people to DC. And this is called the Crip Crawl. This is a series of photos. In fact, the whole history of the movement, largely modern movement, was photographed by a gentleman named Tom Olin. And we have a video interview Mark does with Tom Olin, which I encourage all of you to watch. But this was called Crip Crawl, and this is where folks with disabilities basically crawled their way up the steps of the Capitol building to draw attention to the issue, to make a point, and to put pressure on elected leaders. And it ultimately won. And on July 26th, 1990, the ADA was put into law. And then a number of years after that, kind of succeeding years, the rules were kind of fleshed out and developed on what that was all going to look like. And the ADA is, like I said, different than some of these other. This is a photo of Justin Dart, is the gentleman on the right with the hat, and he is kind of you know, considered the father of the ADA. He has a you know, commonly used phrase, vote like your life depends on it, because it does. So, okay. So the ADA was really impactful because, for a couple of things. One, it was a civil rights law. So people with disabilities were considered a class, a protected class. But the rules that came out of the ADA impacted not just federal buildings, they impacted employment with Title I. They impacted state and local government, or state and local government with Title II. They impact, I think that's right. I'm probably switching these up, but they impacted public accommodations with private businesses and things like that. So think about that lift of telling businesses that you're going to need to make these accommodations in your stores, in your shops, in your buildings. You know, one of the most significant arguments against the ADA was cost, that it was going to be expensive to do all this stuff. And no doubt it was going to be expensive, but the true cost of not providing 25% of the population with access, equal access, just leaves us back in the 1950s with separate but equal, I mean, essentially. So, okay, so yeah, so this is really cool because it didn't just impact like a ramp into a building. It said that there needed to be access to employment. All government needs to do this, needs to make access. Communications, the telecommunications component of this is really important, because that's where we now get teeth to make sure that digital communication is accessible, that Braille is available, that accommodations for somebody who might have a hearing or a vision issue needs to be addressed in a way. So all of these things were really life-changing. I personally, I ended up getting a disability. I ended up joining the largest minority group in the country in 1989, when I happened to like get what's called transverse myelitis. And it's just, you know, I mean, it wasn't a car accident. It wasn't anything like that. It was just like a viral or something. And anyway, they don't really know, and it's not super common. But yeah, in 1989, I think back of what was going on in the United States during that time. I was on a little island in Southeast Alaska, so I did not have a lot of exposure to news or just really anything. And then thinking that a year after I became disabled, the ADA passed. And I think back at my community and how accessible it was. And again, this was a rural little town on an island in Alaska. And we had a lot of new buildings that had been built in town because of the timber money and a lot of the logging jobs and the money that was going back in the community. And it makes me think that a lot of those buildings used federal money because all those buildings were accessible. They had accessible restrooms, they had ramps, they had door, openers, they had all kinds of stuff. And, if that hadn't been the case, I would not have been able to go to school. I would not have been able to get a driver's license. I would not have been able to do anything. And that was before the ADA. So the ADA is a big deal. But there's a lot of work to be done. Like I said earlier, passing a law doesn't solve everybody's problems, and nor should it, right? Like, we should be actively engaged in our communities, creating neighborhoods, creating cities that are not just accessible for us, but accessible for everyone. And that, I think, gets to the idea of universal design, which is really cool. One example I'll give you of where the ADA has failed, and because it's kind of timely, is in emergency preparedness and emergency management. For the last year, before I was hired at LINC, I worked for the state, a state agency, the State Independent Living Council, as an emergency preparedness coordinator type position. And it was really frightening to learn how in Katrina and Rita and all of those major hurricanes, that the systems that are supposed to be in place to protect and to save people, all people, weren't really and are not really in place to help people with disabilities. It's on a good day, okay? On a good day in the city of Boise, you can get from point A to point B on public transportation if it's all working the way it's supposed to go. And I'm involved in public transportation. In fact, my first experience with public transportation was in Boise in 1997 or 8. And I was living in the Idaho building. Cynthia and I were talking about that. And I wanted to go down to the Martin Luther King rally at Boise State University. And I thought, well, I'll just take the bus, which I had never been on, and I'll go down and then just roll back downtown. And I live right downtown, and that would be great. I had a car, I could drive if I wanted to, but I didn't want to, I wanted to take the bus. So I went over, it was one of the buses that has the vertical lift, not the fold out things. Those had lots of problems. And I roll up and I asked the bus driver who was reading the newspaper, I was like, does this bus go to BSU? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, when you're ready, I need to go to BSU. And the guy just kind of stopped and turned his head and looked at me with this like scornful look and threw his newspaper down, newspaper down, and then proceeded to like slam about the inside of the car to get all the ropes and gadgets out. And I just thought to myself, like, holy bleep. Like, I mean, I've had doctors talk to my mom when I was a teenager, right? Instead of me. But this was like super blatant. And I was really pissed. And so I went to the rally and then came back, and I went to the Boise Urban Stages office.
Jeremy, I'm sorry to interrupt you. That was a Boise State bus?
Oh, it was a Boise Urban Stages bus.
Okay, thank you. I was starting to freak out because, okay, never mind.
I mean, it's very good now. Like, service is much better. But I told the guy, I met the director, and I said, look, dude, I'm like, you can do one of two things. You can take a notepad and a pen out, and you can write down what I'm going to tell you, or I can show back up here tomorrow with 50 people, and we can have a press conference in front of your office. And he just kind of pulled the thing out and took the thing out and went through the motions. So that was my so the long story short is, even on a good day, on a blue sky, when we don't have disasters, lots of these systems are sketchy whether or not they're going to work or not, right? So imagine during a disaster, relying on these systems to save you if you don't have access to your own car or supports to get you out. This is a photo of the campfire in California. And the vast majority of people who died in that fire were seniors and people with disabilities. hands down. We know that for a fact. Okay, so what's the silver lining part to this? Because this is all pretty, like, at this point, pretty dark. Let me say something about COVID, and then I'll talk about the silver lining. And what's our time? Because I'm not seeing my clock. Okay. So COVID, it would have been, it would have been nice if, what should I say about COVID? It's a disaster. And I think it is demonstrated once again that if you're a person who lives independently with a disability and has resources and support systems and all those sorts of things, it's still a really bad situation for you, because you don't want to get a call from a doctor 3 months after you had COVID saying that one of your organs doesn't work now, right? Like, having a disability complicates all those things. But if you're a person who lives in an institution, who's been institutionalized and does not have those family supports, lives in a long-term care facility, a nursing facility, congregate housing, any of these places can be death traps for people with disabilities. And we've seen across the country that, again, the vast number of people who have been impacted are folks who are older adults or people with disabilities. There's no getting around it. And when COVID was happening, it was really frustrating to try and figure out, like, okay, who do I talk to? Because everybody's going to do testing, and you keep saying that vulnerable populations are the most important population, but nobody has a plan on how we're going to get testing to people. Oh yeah, we're going to do testing with a drive up. Well, that's great, but people don't drive. They don't own cars. They have economic hardships. They have physical reasons they can't drive. So it's just been a real eye-opener of how far we have to go on so many different fronts. And I would say that goes both ways, not just from professionals who work in emergency management or other spaces, because we have some fantastic emergency management people that we work with, and they would do anything for us at any time. I have absolutely no doubt about that. But we have to do a better job of showing up, right? Like, we have to be at the table, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and we don't want to be on the menu. So it's really important that we do more work to turn our folks out to have a voice and how all this stuff plays out. So COVID, and this, what I'm going to say does not, does not carry across all disabilities, all income groups, all races of folks who have disabilities. All the intersections complicate everything. And that complication is what we call life. And so what I'm going to say doesn't apply to everyone, because there are a lot of people who are experiencing more social isolation. They're experiencing more hardship, more risk. But one thing that we have found over the last 4 or 5 months is that everyone being forced to change how they do business overnight really opened the door for people to participate at a level that was really difficult to do before. So if you were, I'm not going to say names, but like if you were person A who is blind and wants to participate in meetings and events and things like that, like you got to figure out how to get yourself from point A to point B. And that might seem like a pretty straightforward thing to do, especially if you've got a spouse or a friend or somebody who can drive you. But for people who are truly living like kind of independent lives and they don't want to have to rely on other people, the ability to just like zoom into a meeting with everybody else and to participate equally is really a game changer. We have been experimenting with, and I'll tell you, Zoom is probably the best platform. Zoom is very easy to zoom in an ASL interpreter. It's very easy to caption things. It's easy on the virtual eyes of the software that folks who are blind or low vision use to read what's on a screen. So they've done a really good job. And in fact, during COVID, they transformed their technology during COVID to respond to this. And what we have found for a lot of people is that it's kind of been a game changer, and it's opened up opportunities to engage and really for us to build community. Like, you know, I mean, there are always people out there doing stuff on different topics all the time, working on different issues. But I can tell you that this, just my personal sense of community has just been so elevated, even though it's a time of like extreme isolation. We're all in our homes, but it's a time where I have personally experienced, and again, this isn't everybody, but and a lot of the folks we work with have experienced more communication, more collaboration. And that to me is a real silver lining. And it's also forced all of us to try and figure out how to make everything more accessible, right? So before, to add captioning and an ASL interpreter and to do all that stuff, that was hard just to do if you were trying to get an ASL interpreter to a meeting somewhere. But now it's like we can live stream with all of this stuff happening at the same time, all these tools, and these tools are allowing people to participate in ways they haven't before. And so I think that's, you know, with all of the death and the politics and just the toxic stuff going on, I personally feel like this has created kind of little micro opportunities that have really been a game changer. I know, you know, most folks, it's like, maybe it's just an inconvenience. Maybe it's not an inconvenience to be at home in your underwear, you know, attending meetings. But for some folks, it's been really, really impactful, and it's a big deal. So, and the last thing I'll say is that we want to, when I say we, I just mean anybody, you know, anybody I'm working with, you know, at LINC or Idaho Access Project, or through the committees that folks participate on, or wherever, like, we want to collaborate with people. And where we are right now, in my mind, and again, this isn't all encompassing. I have one type of disability. I don't have low vision. I'm not deaf. So, you know, I'm speaking to kind of my lived experience, but working with folks who are blind and low vision and deaf or hard of hearing, or have developmental issues or intellectual disabilities or whatever, physical disabilities, we recognize that the ADA is just a law, but that there are so many opportunities, especially with emerging technology right now, that we can truly create public spaces and environments that are way more accommodating and accessible than we have right now. I'll give you two examples. One is a project we've been working on with the GIM lab at Boise State University. So we've had a couple cohorts of students helping us kind of advance a digital wayfinding program on Boise State's campus to pilot some of that technology. And you know, it can be difficult to navigate around outside using a white cane or a guide dog, but the real challenge comes when you get inside buildings and you're trying to figure out like what room is what. And digital wayfinding allows you to use beacons that on your phone that help you figure out where you're at, or what room you're outside of, or anything like that. So it's kind of a game changer. And then the other thing that we've been doing that's not emerging technology, but it's something that I think is important, and it fits into the work that Deanna does and Jim does and Elaine does, has to do with looking at our neighborhoods through the lens of disability, so that we can better understand how to design communities, buildings, public rights of way in a way that go above and beyond the ADA. Like, we're not just stuck with the ADA, which is a great law, but the ADA was passed in the late 80s, early 90s, and the world is totally different today. And so I think it's incumbent on us, folks with disabilities, but it's also hopefully something that all of you in your different capacities will want to learn more about, collaborate on, ask questions like you're doing here, and just figure out like how we can all in our own individual lives, in our organizations, in our communities, create a more accommodating and inclusive space, which seems to be a common theme in our country these days. Yeah, and so I think that's probably a good stopping point. That was a lot of me talking, and I am incredibly amazed that I talked for that long.
Jeremy, yeah, let's throw it out and see who has some questions. That was a great presentation. I mean, you were absolutely captivating. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Jeremy?
Yeah, this is Molly. I do.
Okay. Go ahead, Molly.
Hi. Hi, Jeremy. Thank
Hi,
you.
Molly.
Well done. My experience is from 7 or 8 years ago, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of help in Idaho for somebody with disabilities who wanted to improve sidewalks. You know, my theory is, so you take the bus and you can get in the building, but how do you get between the two? It's really important that construction sites, that curb ramps, that quality of sidewalks, usability of them be there for people with disabilities, or all the components of the system don't fit together. And what are your thoughts on that?
That is a great question, Molly. It's an issue that many large urban areas still deal with across the country, and it's definitely an issue that smaller rural communities deal with in Idaho, because it takes a lot of money and resources to build sidewalks and public rights of way. I think what I would say is, one, we should connect on that if that's something you want to pursue. But I would say, in addition to that, are you in a rural community?
Yeah, I'm in a city with about 8,000 people.
Okay, so this is kind of technical, but what I would say is every city is supposed to have what's called a transition plan. And do you have a transition plan in your city?
Yeah, it's useless.
Okay, there's a transition plan. And does it include curb ramps and things like that?
Yeah, but nothing's happening.
So you need political action. So you have some tools, but you need to agitate people to doing something.
I was helping a blind friend, and we were unable to find anybody in Idaho to assist, anybody in the legal or disabled community. So, and
Well,
he's not really available to do that anymore, and he's the one with the disability, but it would be nice that as other people step forward in this area, that there is help.
so one of the things that's a great question, and it's a common issue. And one of the things that the Centers for Independent Living should be doing is what we call individual advocacy and then systems advocacy. Individual advocacy is more focused on, helping somebody access a resource through the state or something like that. Systems advocacy has to do with kind of shaking the cage of government to get them to respond to the needs of the citizens in whatever way that would be appropriate. So if you want to connect with me or connect anybody with me, I am happy to kind of explore that further. And then I'm also happy to kind of connect somebody to folks who I know would be interested in the advocacy component of that. And it really does come down to, like I said, you can have a law, but it comes down to people advocating that law be implemented, that all those things happen. And even in Ada County Highway District, I mean, Jim can attest to this. We argue with, politely, but we argue with the staff and try and get them to do things that they sometimes don't want to do or don't think they should do, and but are really important. And so
I understand. And ADA is enforced by complaint.
that's right.
That's important for people to realize. And it puts a lot of onus on people with disabilities.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Well done.
Jeff, go ahead. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. First of all, great presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is, over the last couple, I'm going to say 10 to 15 years, I've seen investments in what I might call no-touch things like automatic doors, or in restrooms, sinks that are automatic by hand motion, that type of thing. It just a hunch, not research, but just a hunch, is that the current healthcare issues that COVID presents is going to bring a new sense of interest in people investing in those technologies to further reduce the degrees to which you have to grab a handle or turn a knob. And so my question is, on the surface, it would seem like that's probably to the benefit of people who have certain types of disabilities. But I'm wondering if there is any kind of unintended consequence of continuing down that path of automated solutions.
That's another great question. And we've had that conversation in one form or another many times over the last couple months with different people. I have personally, just in our circles, as we see, a big push to install automatic door openers. And we're like, damn it, we've been asking for automatic door openers for months, and it's like, or years. And it's like, now all of a sudden, when the white kids go down to the South and end up something bad happening to them, then all of a sudden the world is focused on that. Right. And I think there's similar trends, historical trends there. And I think that's a common one, right? Like how it's just interesting how quickly we can move when the majority of people are impacted in a certain way. I think that's why it's really important to have cross disability involvement in all of these things, because it's super complicated, and one thing that works really well for a chair user might not really work well for somebody who uses a white cane in terms of tactile navigation. Every time you introduce a variable, you kind of have to think through how that impacts other users who have different types of disabilities. I mean, I hate those little truncated dome things, because whenever I roll over them, it's like that. It's just like, but I'm like, you know what? Like that's the price I'm going to pay to make sure that people, can safely move around their community, and I'm fine with it. That's a small example, but you're right. We have to keep our eyes and minds wide open to how the changes that we're making rapidly will impact all the people who need to use those services and resources.
Go ahead, Deborah.
I have a question about transportation, because I think since it is a minority of people that cannot drive, transportation is definitely a very high obstacle, I think, in Boise for people with disabilities. I think the emphasis on car is so strong that they don't even talk about all the people that are isolated and cannot even go to the doctor in an emergency case because they have to wait 2 days before they get transportation. And how do you see transportation in relation to disabilities in Boise?
How do I see it? It's an important issue. And I think there's a lot of groups of people who could probably talk about transportation in their lives. And we could just fill in the blanks, right? Like fill in the blank disability, fill in the blank, somebody experiencing poverty, fill in the blank single mom who can't afford. So I think at the end of the day, the lesson for us is that far more people benefit from public transportation than don't, and that kind of investment is indeed, from what you said, it's a challenge for people who have disabilities to navigate the world, to navigate their communities. You know, we're fortunate to have, although we don't have adequate funding for our transportation department, and that's not the result of anybody on this Zoom calls, you know, fault. Everybody on this Zoom call has been, you know, I know Elaine has been dealing with this for years, and Jim, and everybody has been trying to figure out, like, how do we do this? And we all know what the barriers are, and who the barriers are. But at the end of the day, transportation is freedom. And we kind of have to look at it that way. And then you can layer on all kinds of other stuff like protecting the environment, reducing trips, congestion, making our cities more livable, all that sort of stuff, pollution reduction, all that sort of stuff. But I'll also say that we're fortunate too, though, to have a lot of really good people who work in public transportation. You know, the city of Boise supports public transportation in a significant way. We have a really great director of our bus system, of our Valley Regional Transit System, who I've worked with for, you know, 2 decades now, and in a volunteer capacity on committees and things. And, you know, I don't think our problems around transportation are for a lack of want. I think they're for a lack of access to the resources we need to make things real. And that directly goes to benefiting people with disabilities. We do have a great access paratransit program, which has gotten a little better, I think, over the last couple of years. But you know, I've been stranded at 10 in the morning in Garden City on the side of the road because I missed a bus or the bus missed me, and you know, I'm not getting out of there. Like, I'm there until 5 o'clock. And so those sorts of things are a real challenge on so many fronts, not just disability. I also, Deanna's prodding, I put a link to the report that we did for Barber Valley. So if you're interested in seeing some of the things that we found, some of the initiatives that we're interested in have to do with like making homes more visitable, particularly for, you know, as we have more people who are older adults in our communities, and looking at making sure that we have the right vehicles so that folks with disabilities have a seat at the table to help advise decision makers and things like that. So there's some interesting stuff in there.
Hey, Jeremy, can you also just type in the name of that movie that you showed the picture of, just so that, because I didn't catch that. So if people want to watch that, that sounds like something really worthwhile.
There was one more question. I don't know if we have time to cover it, but Diane, if you want to unmute and introduce your question.
Oh, I got your question, Diane.
Okay, yeah, I'm a year 1 baby boomer, and I don't think of myself as disabled. And I think about 1 million people are like me, but yet we are, and we certainly will be at some point. And is that something that you're thinking about in terms of, you know, coming down the line in the next 15, 20 years, we're going to have a lot of people who are, you know, new disability, so to speak. How are you going to deal with that?
That is super challenging. You know, it's an interesting dance between disability organizations and like AARP, for example, because folks don't want to be, you know, just because you're, you know, hit your 70s or 80s. I know tons of people in their 70s or 80s who are like doing crazy stuff that I wouldn't venture out to do. And so, you know, we have to figure out how to talk about those issues in a way that's more inclusive, I think. And I don't know that we've actually got there yet, but I know that's a conversation that that seems to be had over and over and over again. But you hit a good point. And I think that's where we kind of all gravitate towards universal design, because then it's just everybody, right? It's not a disabled person or older adult or whatever. It's just, you know.
Right. Thank you.
I see that Jeff has his hand up, but before I ask you a question, Jeff, just because we're bumping up against 1 hour, so hang on a second. Jeremy, do you want to, Jeremy's going to present at our transportation conference on October 28th. Do you want to talk about that presentation at all?
Yeah, and actually, sorry, I've got another Zoom I gotta go do. Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about, I think we're going to get into a little bit more detail about transportation accessibility and neighborhood design, visitability, things like that. So we're going to hone in on a couple of topics. We're going to have a panel that is 2 women that I work with. One is in a power chair and the other one navigates with a guide dog. And they have really, really insightful things to say. But I also want to pitch, if you're interested, the week of September 14th, and you can go to our website, LINC Idaho, LINC Idaho.org. And we have a independent living conference that's happening the week of September 14th. And there will be a number of different presentations and talks and panels and things on independent living, on voting rights, on all kinds of stuff, anything that kind of intersects with disability, which is most everything. So definitely check that out as well, the Independent Living Conference.
Can you send us something on that, Jeremy, so that we can share it with everybody, even if it's just a link to a website or something?
Yep.
Do you have time? Do you have time for one more question, or do you have to go?
I have to go. I got a Idaho Office of Emergency Management meeting to talk about a program that helps when the power goes out, and then how do you know where all the people are who have medically electrical dependent equipment, right?
Okay, no worries. Thank you. That was incredible today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome anytime. Thanks everybody for coming today and being a part of this. It's nice to see all of you. It's good to check in. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Jeremy.